shifting the focus, the attention specifically on President Cyril Ramaphosa's leadership over the energy crisis. How has he handled the power challenges in the country? During the COVID-19 pandemic, you'll recall that we had regular updates called family meetings, yet when it comes to the energy insecurity, nothing has come from the president. Instead, he's chosen to express his views via ANC platforms. Well, let's speak further on the president's leadership over the handling of the power crisis, and we're joined by the founding dean at the Gordon Institute of Business Science, Professor Nick Binedell, who speaks to us overseas this morning. Prof, good morning to you, and thank you for allowing us to interrupt your travels, but we desperately need your wise counsel here in the country. Let's start with your honest assessment of the handling of the power crisis by the country's leadership.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and it's great to connect. So, look, it's a very, very complicated issue, and I'm sure we'll get into some of the core leadership questions. It's a crisis for the country because unlike some of the other crises that aren't so visible, power is needed to run the economy, to run our lives, to ensure learning happens, and so we have been plunged into a crisis. And in a crisis, leadership is really tested. I think of the many examples of leadership in battle or leadership in some or other economic or social crisis. Then one wants confidence in the leadership, and leadership should be visible to the public and regularly briefing the public, either through parliament or press conferences. One almost wants a daily update on what is happening. And I think it has been a long period where we haven't heard from the president, and your analogy of COVID-19 is a good one. All right.
Well, I suppose then you agree with the very next question I was going to ask you, to say, if we look back at the handling of the COVID-19, is it an unfair expectation that the president should give regular updates to the country given the severe power shortages we have?
You know, it's very complicated, these questions, because the president is the chief executive of the biggest organization in the country, and it's extremely complex, as we all know, to be the president of a country. You have to delegate certain powers. Our laws require the delegation of certain powers, as we saw with the NERSA price increase issue. And so the president has many things on his agenda. But when there's a crisis like this, like an earthquake or a tsunami, then people want to feel the emotional presence of the president. Now, I think to some extent we've seen that over Eskom. He has expressed his views in different platforms, as you indicated. But he's the formal head. You know, he may be the ANC's leader, but he's all of us, our president. And we want that visibility and we want that connectivity. The problem is that Eskom is in some ways not as simple as COVID, although COVID was very complex. It became simpler. Eskom has simply got more and more complex and is very, very difficult to resolve. I know Eskom quite well. I've worked with many of its chief executives and boards, and it's a very bureaucratic organization. It's deeply capital intensive. It's very technological, and it's easy to say, you know, we should fix power load shedding, as was said at the conference in December. But these are deep, complex problems, and so maybe he's got nothing to tell us. And he's told us what the crisis committee has come up with, the 6 points, and maybe in his view that's enough given whatever else he's got. But from the public's point of view, I think there is a need for better communication. And also the fact that different ministers are saying different things is not helpful in a crisis. People want a focal point of communication and clarity about that. And when there's this kind of crisis, as I said, we do want to personally see the president clearly taking charge and communicating with us regularly.
You've already touched on the ministers saying different things. Some critics saying this is actually the failure of the president to marshal his ministers in order to lead us out of this crisis. Essentially, the question here, Prof, is what does this tell us about the president's authority over his cabinet?
Well, remember the ANC's history and culture born out of its Marxist-Leninist ideology, is a collective decision-making. So if you look at the removal of President Zuma or President Mbeki, these were collective consensus that developed over time. We don't have an authoritarian style of leadership. We have a consensus style. So the job then is to manage for the president to be the first amongst equals, and therefore to coerce or encourage or motivate or instruct cabinet to behave in a particular way is what I think we are now needing more than everybody just expressing their view. You know, I've learned a lot about political leadership and leadership of the state over the years. There was a story that in American history, after the war, a civilian became the president, President Truman. He was followed then by General Eisenhower, who had been the Allied commander in the Second World War. And when Truman was handing over, he turned to his aides and he said, poor old Eisenhower, he will issue instructions believing they'll be followed. But of course, in the political system, in the state system, it's quite easy not to execute fast enough or exactly what you're told to do. So I think that's part of the complexity. The price of democracy sometimes is slower decision-making. But I think this has gone past that. What this shows is the ANC is not very united. But more importantly for me is its ability to govern the state is compromised. So whether it's Eskom or Transnet or other SOEs, or whether it's government departments themselves or the three tiers of government, all of them seem to be taking major strain in terms of coordination, agreement, and speed of execution. This crisis needs a speedy resolution, as speedy as technically possible. And so we see the Minister of Finance not releasing money for diesel and so on. It goes round and round in a circle. And so I think in a way, as an outsider, we can say he seems not to be exercising authority. Maybe he is. Maybe we don't see the inside drama, and we'll see with the new cabinet appointments whether there's any dynamics there. But I would say it looks from the outside like an insufficient use of presidential authority.
Yeah. Prof. Binedell, you are someone who has sat in a presidential advisory council, and what is being demanded of President Ramaphosa is decisive leadership. What you said earlier might be very disconcerting to South Africans who are listening to us when you said it is possible that the reason President Ramaphosa has not addressed the nation formally, as he usually does, is because he probably doesn't have anything to say. What would you advise? It's not that he doesn't have
anything to say. It's that what he has to say is going to take so long to implement. And we all know that. There's no solution in the short term to the lower levels of load shedding. We know that as an engineering scientific fact. There are some short-term improvements that can be made, but we're not going to get out of the load shedding territory for some time. So what does he say? And he, I think, has said what he can say. So there's a limit to how much you can communicate, but I certainly, for one, and I think many of our citizens, would like to see him front and center a bit more visibly than we are.
Well, as a demonstration then, Professor, of exactly what you have just said, that perhaps there has been a lot that's been said and there is a risk to over-communicating, one would say, has the president actually even gone beyond that line where he has over-communicated? And this has to do with the electricity tariff increase. He says he has asked the Eskom board to stop with the implementation of this tariff, but other experts in the field tell us that, but that can't be the president's call, because NERSA is an institution that answers to Parliament. Yes, they merely approved an Eskom tariff increase, which was asked for by Eskom, but has the president, in his attempt to appease the nation, put Eskom in a tight spot because they need the money to fix some of the problems?
I think that's true. And of course, in a democracy, as I said earlier, life's more complicated than in China, where you just issue an instruction. In South Africa, because we're a constitutional democracy, there are legislative, procedural, regulatory requirements. And NERSA, as you said, is an independent body. So for him to say that, in a way, is exactly what we're calling for, to speak more and tell us how he's going to solve it. And he comes up with the idea that we should hold back on the increase because of the effect on consumers and businesses. But he's not really able to impose that. So he's maybe suggested it to Eskom, and now Eskom must work with NERSA to decide how they can manage it. And the problem we've got is Treasury says it's got no more money, which is true. And so it goes back and forth and back and forth. And this is the malaise, I think. I think there are three problems in the political state alignment. The one is it's legally very complex. We have a complex legal system. And secondly, we are administratively very slow in getting things done. You can look at any aspect of state translation of policy to action. It is very, very slow. I've spent time in Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia in the last 2 months, and these countries are moving twice or three times faster than us because somehow they're able to make either an authoritarian government work or their democracy work. We are very, very slow, very weak at administration. And the third is the mindset of urgency. We tend to be very reactive. We wait for a crisis until we 3-1 down at half-time, and then we summon up a bit of energy to try and solve a crisis instead of being able to look ahead and deal with this. We have known about the Eskom problem for almost, at least 15 years now. And money has not been spent on maintenance. The salaries have been bloated. Eskom salaries are extremely high. We've overmanned, over-resourced Eskom, in fact. We've lost a lot of technical skill. These things were there 15, 10 years ago. So this is a very poor reaction. I just want to add one thing to this because we're talking about Eskom so much. I think there are many other crises that are not so visible. One, for example, would be education. Our public education system's performance is largely invisible to us, but we will live with its performance consequence for generations to come. It's not being talked about during COVID. It's not being talked about now. So Eskom, in a way, takes our attention away from some of the other delivery problems, social services, the state-owned enterprises. And I would say this, in a democracy, you must have vigilant, active citizens. You can't just look after your own interests. If you have an understanding of these issues broadly, you must become engaged in the public debate. We have both the right and the responsibility to do so. When that doesn't happen, you have a Zimbabwean situation emerge where the elite, a very small elite, control the country and the masses remain disconnected from any say in the government. South Africa puts itself forward as a constitutional democracy, a participative, inclusive, free and fair constitutional democracy. And that means we should make noise and we should be critical. It's our right and our responsibility to do so.
Well, on that note, Professor, of a civil society, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds as though you're saying civil society as you know it, an agitated civil society in South Africa is fast asleep. If the mishandling of this crisis does continue, could it pose a risk to the stability of the country?
It does pose a sovereign risk. It poses several risks. The indirect risk, which we haven't really seen the consequences yet of stage 6, like load shedding, on livelihoods, on small businesses, on businesses closing, on lack of investment that never happens because people are unconfident. We haven't seen all of those yet. They may mature as time goes. So I think there is this danger that this is a really strategic problem, as I said at the beginning. Civil society in the 80s, when I had hair and was younger, I was involved with civil society, and civil society really challenged the hegemony of the old government. It challenged it through public protests, through civic action. Our religious leaders were in those trenches, and civil society really became an enormous source of energy. I'm in the Philippines where a dictator was overthrown, Marcos, and it was because of an Archbishop of Manila, who funnily enough had the name Cardinal Sin, who supported the removal of the president and called on the people to march on his palace. This is a Catholic country, and they responded to his personal leadership. Now, I'm not saying that's what we should do. What I'm saying, though, is that we need religious, labor, civil society, NGOs, foundations, and think tanks, as well as the media, to make clear that this is unacceptable. It's unacceptable that South Africa doesn't have power when we have enormous reserves of energy in our coal. It's unacceptable for young children in rural areas not to have electricity consistently at a reasonable price. That is unacceptable to us, and we should express our lack of acceptability of that situation.
You've prompted another question now, Professor, and I'm desperate to let you go. But you're saying that for a country that has large reserves of coal to be plunged in darkness, it simply is unacceptable. There is a raging debate between a Minister of Energy who is seen as a fossil fuel type of a person versus those who are saying the just energy transition. And that, by the way, it is led by the president as seen in Sharm el-Sheikh last year. Where do you stand on this matter?
Well, you have to do both. I was just listening to a debate in Europe about climate change, and these were major leaders of the global economy, all saying the number one agenda for the world is the climate crisis. You can't choose between these. This is and territory. And fortunately, we have the capacity to build renewables. We have the natural benefit of wind and sunlight. And so we can, in fact, generate electricity through other means. In the meantime, we've got to use the coal to best effect. So I'm sure that Minister Creasy and Minister Mantashe and Minister Godongwana should be in a room talking about how these align to sequence the timing of it. South Africa will not be allowed to stay out of the just transition, and it will get funding to be in the just transition, as it already has. So these are not ors, these are ands.
Final question, Professor. As someone who has advised the president before, I'm not particularly saying this one, what would you be advising him to do right now in a situation like this?
So let me clarify. I have met with the president and many of the ministers, some of the ministers, but I'm not a formal advisor. I've just always been interested in public life in South Africa. So my advice would be to think very carefully about the cabinet. And we've seen some interesting shifts in the climate. Now, I do think that this Nasrec in December, there seemed to be a move away from the blind ideology that the ANC seemed to take with it from the time of our first elections. And so maybe now there's a bit more panic, there's a bit more realism, there's a bit more urgency. And what we have to do is pick the best possible people to do the job, every job, all the senior jobs in government. We need to really think about who should be doing these jobs given the nature of the crisis. Because the cost of bad leadership in government or bad political leadership is going to be felt by every South African. It doesn't matter who you are or what you do. You're going to feel that way. And we don't want to lose this country. You know, I spent 2 months studying these Asian countries, and to see what they've managed to do under very different political systems is remarkable. I'm in Manila. I was here 10 years ago. The buildings were 10 stories. I'm in a hotel of 35. The one next to me is 75 stories. It looks like Manhattan. They've done that in 10, 20 years. Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, all these countries are changing the quality of the life of their citizens, one way or another. And we have to realize South Africa is behaving like an island. You know, I said in an interview yesterday that economic growth is the oxygen of democracy. Without economic growth, we can't fund transformation. And without transformation, our democratic project will get stuck in a swamp. So we have to get investment. We need economically minded ministers who are capable of persuading their colleagues in provinces and cities to shift our attention to the thing that matters most to South Africans. In addition to their human rights and political rights, it's their standard of living. And if we compare South Africa to most other countries that are similar to us, we are being left in the dust. And we cannot accept that. We have to argue that politics drives economics, bad politics makes bad economics, and good politics makes good economics. We've got the institutions, we've got the legislation, we've got the law courts, we've got the media. It's the center of South Africa that must look beyond its own interests and say, this is where we need to go, and create an environment in which political parties are responsive to the opinion of the public much more sincerely than they currently are.
Professor Nick Binedell, thank you very much for your time and indeed your insights. Well,